A good Erev Shabbos. Well, it's a fascinating exercise in thought and practice when we have two values that seem to clash with one another, and we have to think through how to prioritize what. You have to admit the Jewish people have given broad-ranging and very careful thought to what we believe in and what we do, and what happens when we have moral and practical conflicts. The most simple example that we always mention is a bris on Shabbat. A bris milah is supposed to be on the 8th day. On Shabbos, we're not supposed to cause any wounds or draw blood. And that's just what a bris milah is. So do we push aside the requirement of the 8th day, or do we suspend that rule of Shabbat? Next Shabbos is Hanukkah. I don't think any of us encounter this problem, but the sources ask the question of what should a person do who can only afford either Shabbat candles or Hanukkah lights, but not both. Which takes priority? Is it more important to publicize the miracle of Hanukkah? That's what the menorah does. Or is it more important to bring peace into our homes, which is what the Shabbos lights do? Another famous question from the Gemara in Ksubis: what happens when a wedding party meets a funeral procession at a crossroads? Who has the right of way? Think of that one and tell me your answer this Shabbos at the Kiddush. Here's one quandary of today. This week, the rabbis of Toronto decided that this should be a Shabbat of awareness about MAID, medically assisted dying, which is considered murder in Jewish law. Yes, even when done by a doctor or a nurse. Yes, even when done with the best of intentions. And yes, even with intent to relieve suffering through killing. It's absolutely, categorically forbidden under any and all circumstances. The flyers that we printed up that you'll find in Shul have in bold letters, "We believe in the sanctity of human life." And that's absolutely true. So one conversation we should be having this Shabbos is to go into what that means, what the sanctity of life involves, what end-of-life care could mean. Surely it will one day be relevant to each and every one of us. May we all live to 120. And it's also important for us to make our wishes known so that we do not allow or permit ourselves to undergo this under any circumstances, God forbid. Let's not confuse palliative care, which is important and critical in many situations, with assisted dying, which used to be illegal here, but now is legal and on a rapid rise. It's still not right. Make no mistake, even though many people are trying to blur the boundaries. Now, at the same time, we're supposed to be having this conversation about the sanctity of human life. We face a battle on multiple fronts with people who do not believe in the sanctity of our human lives, meaning when the humans involved are Jews. From the horror of the pogrom in Israel and everything that goes along with it, that people around the world are still hesitant to condemn, to the captives, the hostages still being held against their will in Gaza or wherever they are. May they all be well and come home now. From the chants around the world of from the river to the sea, which certainly sounds an awful lot like ethnic cleansing, if you stop to think about it. There's a real battle going on for the existence, let alone the well-being and safety and security of the Jewish state. And whether people like to admit it or not, the entire Jewish people is bound up in so many ways with that struggle. And it's in our very parsha this week of Vayishlach, our Torah portion, that recounts the incident of Dinah and its aftermath, that the Torah opens a whole conversation on one of the most pertinent issues of this moment in history, the problem of civilian casualties in war. How do you fight a war when there might, or are sure to be, civilians harmed or even killed? What are the rules? What are the limits? The story in our Parsha of Vayishlach this week, in brief, is this. A fella named Shechem from the Chivi people kidnaps and rapes Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov and Leah, the sister of the 12 tribes. The father, Hamor, comes to Yaakov and asks him to let his son have Dinah as a wife. Note that no one asks Dinah here. When Dinah's brothers, Shimon and Levi, find out about it, they are horrified and they hatch a plan. They get their father to tell Hamor that if all his people meaning all the men will undergo circumcision, then Shechem can marry Dinah. They agree, and as they're recovering from their circs, Shimon and Levi sweep into their territory and slaughter the entire band of Chivites, including Shechem and his son Hamor, the original assailant. You have in this brief story from our parsha the whole question of civilian casualties, ethical and just war. And what emerges from it is the Jewish obligation, or perhaps lack of it, to prevent non-combatant deaths in a time of war. Much of this conversation comes from an article by Rabbi Chaim Jachter from Kol Torah, which is in the Shul, if you'd like to look at the details. Let's understand a few things at the outset of the discussion. The Jewish people are not expected to be pacifists and avoid war at all costs. There is a concept of milchemes mitzvah, an obligatory war of self-defense and self-preservation, as distinct from a milchemet reshus, an optional war with the sole purpose of expanding boundaries of the land of Israel, which has to happen with the consent of a Jewish king. You notice there hasn't been a king of Israel, at least if not officially, for 2,500 years. And there's a lively debate as to whether the government of the state of Israel has the powers of a Jewish king or not. In any event, there's a rich discussion of war, the ethics of treaties, the imperative not to cause wanton destruction, even in times of war, and even the obligation of hygiene for Jewish soldiers. There's a lot in the sources. Another important thing to note is that the Jewish people is not on any kind of a quest to make the whole world Jewish. It's enough to try to make the Jews Jewish. That's plenty of work in and of itself. At the same time, the Torah does articulate a moral vision for humanity, which we refer to as the 7 mitzvahs of the children of Noah. In other words, all of humanity, the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. There are 6 prohibitions of idolatry, blasphemy, immorality, theft, murder, and cruelty to animals, and 1 positive mitzvah, the obligation to establish courts of law and systems of justice in society. That's all we ask of the rest of the human race. Not so much, it would seem, but then again, a heavy lift for a surprising number of people. Okay, looking at the story of Shimon and Levi avenging the violation of their sister, 3 perspectives emerge. Rambam, Maimonides, understands that the 2 brothers acted appropriately in the eyes of halacha. That last universal mitzvah that we mentioned, the obligation to establish just systems of law, includes an obligation on the part of all humanity to uproot and eliminate evil from its midst. No one can say, well, we were just following orders, or we didn't know what the rulers were doing in our name. It's no excuse. You have to read the papers, you have to look around, and you have to keep your eyes open to what's going on. So given the failure of the Chivi nation to prevent Shechem from abducting a Jewish girl and raping her, then holding her captive, if anyone sees any parallels to today's news, you'll let me know. The entire community was guilty of violating the Noahide law's imperative to uproot evil and establish justice, and therefore they were all liable to the death penalty. That's one view. In contrast, we have the view of Nachmanides, Ramban, who disagrees very strongly. He believes that Shimon and Levi had justification for killing Shechem and Hamor as perpetrators of a crime against their sister. However, the rest of the population was not culpable, as they didn't do anything to harm Yaakov's family, the Bnei Yisrael. Ramban argues that the residents of an area do not deserve collective punishment for the evil actions of their leader. They cannot always be expected to remove a bad guy at the top. Ramban says further that even if the Chivim did deserve punishment on some other grounds, Shimon and Levi had no authorization to carry that out. Now, there's yet another perspective, that of the Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Loew of Prague, who lived a few hundred years after the Rambam and the Ramban. Maharal was Rav first of Posen, then the chief rabbi of Poland, and toward the end of his life, he moved back to Prague. It's where he died in 1609. He wrote a superb commentary called Gur Aryeh, a commentary on Rashi's commentary, Mi Kamcha Yisrael. Maharal says that, on the one hand, the people of Shechem cannot be held punishable for the actions of their leaders, because the leaders were acting in a coercive manner. And at the same time, Maharal says that Shimon and Levi's inflicting heavy civilian casualties was, nevertheless, justified. How can that be? The Maharal says it depends on the situation. As we said, there is a right, an obligation even, as its name implies, of milchemet mitzvah, an obligatory war. When another nation attacks us, it's not a choice, will we defend ourselves or not? It's a mitzvah. We must defend ourselves. There's no mitzvah to become a martyr here. And, though the Maharal obviously didn't have this text at hand, the first clause of the Code of Ethics of the Israel Defense Forces says that it's a moral imperative to win. Once Bnei Yisrael are attacked, in this case in the form of the abduction of their sister Dinah, there was war. And the way war is waged is you attack the people. So we jump right away to the question of total war, where everyone is a target without distinction between civilians and combatants. This is the question that's in all the papers today. The firebombing of Dresden and the atomic bombs on Japan during World War II. These were not intended to target civilians per se, but rather to end the war as quickly as possible by breaking the enemy's will to fight. There's evidence for the concept of total war throughout the 20th century and even in the 19th centuries. Maybe General Sherman's march to the sea in 1864, destroying everything in his path during the American Civil War, is the most famous or most notorious example. When fighting in Vietnam against an irregular guerrilla army, American soldiers wore graffiti on their helmets that said, "Kill 'em all, let God sort 'em out." If you think that's a harsh and heartless view of war, it's interesting to note that it dates back, how far do you think? To the Albigensian Crusade in southern France in the year 1209. Humans have been fighting pretty brutally with one another for a long time, haven't we? Speaking of France, the Radak, a 12th century commentary from Narbonne, notes that King David was not granted the honor of building the temple in Jerusalem, the house of peace, because of the blood that he had shed, meaning the blood of non-combatants killed in the course of battle. While King David was not held liable for these civilian deaths because his intention was to win the war and stop the enemies of the Jewish people, it still disqualified him from building the Beis HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. Yet we see that asking the Jewish army to distinguish between civilians and combatants may be an impossible task. Remember that we had to put blood on the doorposts of our houses in Egypt to signal the destructive force during the plague of slaying the firstborn. A Gemara in Bava Kama explains to us that once permission is given to the mashchis, the force of destruction, to unleash its power, it does not distinguish between good people and bad people. Remember a few weeks ago, the beginning of Parshas Noach, when the world was full of, what did we say? Hamas. And God said, Hineni mashchisam es haaretz. I'm going to destroy the entire world. It seems, says Rabbi Jachter, that God, who is merciful and good to all, would punish the good along with the bad if no alternative exists. All this is the issue of the obligation of distinguishing between civilians and combatants. The question rises to another level when we ask, is it necessary? Or another way to ask, is it permissible to risk the lives of Jewish soldiers to protect the lives of non-combatants on the other side? Rav Lichtenstein of Gush, who passed away a few years ago, wrote that Israel must absolutely consider the extent of the justification of killing a large group of civilians mixed with enemy soldiers in order to save the life of a single Israeli soldier. In other words, the amount of civilian casualties is a factor to consider in battle plans. The late chief rabbi, Rav Avram Shapiro, disagrees. He and his colleague Rav Lior wrote that in times of war there surely exists firm halachic basis for any action done in order to ensure that not even one soldier should be, God forbid, harmed. Think back to the situation 20 years ago in Jenin. The Israeli army could have bombed the refugee camp where these terrorists were based, but instead mounted a house-to-house campaign with infantry soldiers to try to minimize civilian casualties. Notwithstanding the distortions in world media that emerged from this, non-combatant casualties were in fact kept to a minimum, something like 52 or 53 killed, but at the cost of 23 Israeli soldiers fallen. If you hold like some opinions, that's the cost of war. If you hold like the second opinion, it may not be permissible to put any Jewish soldiers at risk, even to minimize civilian casualties on the opposing side. Rav Bleich cautions that if Israel considers what Palestinians will do in response to military campaigns, they may be justified in putting IDF soldiers at risk. Seems to be basis in a Gemara in Shavuos that allows the Jewish king to risk up to 1/6 of the population in attempting to secure the country in time of war. All this assumes that it's time of war. But whose choice is that? Not ours. It's our adversaries. Let's just conclude by reminding ourselves that as the Torah instructs us always to offer peace terms before laying siege, we can remember that the Jewish community in the Holy Land accepted and was ready to abide by the partition plans of 1937 and 1947, and was ready to make peace in 1967 and at Camp David in 2000. The Palestinian community rejected each and every one every single time. Rabbi Jachter writes, misplaced compassion for enemy soldiers and civilians cannot hamstring our efforts to effectively wage war. We hope and we pray that all this conversation will soon become purely academic, purely Torah Lishma, as our enemies will come to appreciate that they have much more to gain through peace than through war, and we can all finally enjoy a secure and successful peace. As we prepare this Shabbos for Hanukkah, which begins this week, may the light of the Jewish people and the state of Israel increase day by day, as do the lights of Hanukkah, until the whole world wakes up to the prophet's voice and vision of peace. V'alu mashim b'har Tzion lishpot es har Esav, v'haya la'Hashem ha'melucha. That the saviors will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esav, and the kingdom will be God's. May we see it speedily. A good Shabbos.